that kind of stuff would be quite rife. So being in a prison like that, you would want a rapid trial. You'd absolutely want a rapid trial, because if not, that you had more of a chance of starving to death or becoming a victim to someone else in there, or, catching a disease and just dying. So that's why people always wanted a quick trial. They wanted to get it over and done with. They didn't want to suffer in that way, which I can understand. So the cover of the records of Janet's trial notes that the accusations against her, they begin with a notice signed 1657 witches, following two men, one of whom was known as Even the Devil's General, who had been convicted and executed that same year, had delated Janet as the actual witch. She was also said to be of an evil, reputed to be a witch many years before. In addition to meeting the devil in company on various occasions, having sex with him, a charge that she'd already been done for, actually, that she also apparently received his mark, which was on her shoulder. She had met him in her own house, apparently, as well, in Old Liston. There she'd been removed. Her son was removed to another house, actually, while she had a violent argument with the devil, apparently. And then threw her over the wall of her yard and hurt her arm. Now, adultery and fornication was extremely bad back then. And because this was with the devil, well, it was even worse back then for stuff like that. But regardless, she definitely would have been punished for just that alone. But the fact that she actually confessed to sex with Satan, that makes it quite more punishable, because it came from her own lips. She didn't deny it or anything like that. She just literally admitted to it, and explained everything like it was the truth, and it happened. So there wouldn't have been any doubt back then, because this was all very believable, And there was a long and ancient tradition of physical contact of one kind or another between humans and the devil, not to mention human beings and other non-human entities, such as fairies. There's a lot of that as well. And Janet, well, she was a long line of people, actually, to have undergone this particular kind of experience. Not only that, she'd gone through it several times, actually. And that's something that's not noted much in all of Janet's stories, because if you remember, we went on to how she did have sexual intercourse apparently with this devil or whatever, but apparently there is other ramblings, I suppose, where she tells people that there was more than just the devil. It was other beings as well, and that she had other beings that worked for her. Now remember, as we finished up before, I said this wouldn't have been seen as a fanciful account, something made up. It was something very believable back then. So in the court papers, it seems to follow 6 charges of malefice. First, James Dundas from Old Liston contracted a lingering and deadly sickness, whereof he never recovered till said Janet was apprehended. Secondly, James was in one of his fields, binding some corn, when Janet appeared apparently in the shape of a cat, and stared at him. He threw his bonnet at her, but his bonnet disappeared, at which he was frightened, mounted his horse, and rode home. Unfortunately, his horse then bolted, carried him to a pond, and threw him in, to the danger of his life if he had not been rescued. Shortly afterwards, he lost 11 horses and cows to sudden sickness, even though there were no instances of disease among the local farm animals, so it would have looked extremely suspicious. But also, if he'd not seen Janet before his horse did that, he could have still put it down to Janet and could have said that he put, in place of his horse, he probably put a goblin horse, they would call them, or they would call them the Kelpies. And that's another belief that they had as well, that witches could do that. Thirdly, Janet quarrelled with Thomas Peacock, also from Old Liston, upon which she knelt down and ritually cursed him. A day or two later, one of his cows became ill, and Thomas threatened to take its corpse and dump it at Janet's door if it died. So Janet sent a charmer to him. The cow recovered. It's quite interesting that, isn't it? That, that she lifted a curse herself. Yeah, here we are. She's being blamed for all this, but she actually did good. Fourthly, because James Wilkard refused to let her hire a horse from him, Janet magically killed 3 horses and a cow belonging to him. Fifthly, Janet confessed to David Lindsay as well. I don't know what she was doing over there in that area, but she seems to have moved back and forth from different places while they did the different trials. One of the elders of Kirkliston, Kirksession, said that she was a witch and offered him 200 merks to look after her children. 200 merks was a considerable sum, roughly the equivalent of a year's wages for 17 agricultural servants or cooks or Baxters or Brewsters. Janet, however, did not have this kind of money herself. She was relying on a local landowner, Sir Alexander Inglis of Ingliston, who had stood guarantor for her bond. That's interesting. So we look at the 6th marking, and that is that Janet quarrelled with Mungo Steele and cursed him, and the next day he contracted an illness which kept him bedridden until he died. The charges against Janet then fall into these 4 different categories, though there are 6 charges. They come under 4. A, she was delated as a witch by other witches. B, she had the reputation of being a witch. C, she trafficked with the devil and bore his mark. D, she performed certain acts of vengeful magic against humans and animals. The complaints of Malafis were almost entirely local, that is, they arose from inhabitants of her own village. The delation by confessing witches had happened 9 years before Janet's examination by Kirkliston Kirksession, and she would almost certainly have been investigated at the time, as David Lindsay, one of Kirkliston's elders, was noted as a witness to this charge. But nothing judicial could have come of it. Except perhaps the fact that, some penance of some kind would have been paid, but nothing like major or anything. Janet had clearly been at liberty since. Her confession to being a witch seems to have taken place under pressure from David Lindsay, who had appointed by the session to watch her during the imprisonment. This watching is often taken to mean the same as depriving a person of sleep, but the two are not identical. Watching was done partly to see whether she or he was visited by Satan or called upon the familiar spirit to affect her or try and liberate them, I suppose. Nor was watching a process confined to witchcraft cases. Lindsay was therefore taking an opportunity to elicit a confession, or at least more information to help her ease her conscience, save herself from damnation. In other words, he would have seen himself as a spiritual guide and counsellor, wrestling with the devil for Janet's soul, as happened, for example, in the case of Janet Mann from Stenton in March 1659. She could not get a heart to repent, for the devil was locked in her heart, till once, after prayer made by the minister, she got freedom to confess her other sins, and then she thought her heart was something lifted up, and now she thanks God she hath gotten a heart to confess the sin of witchcraft too. Thus David Lindsay, I was speaking to her anent the sin of witchcraft, he recorded. I desired her that she would confess her sin of witchcraft and get mercy. She said she had something to say, but she could not get liberty, this permission to say it. The next day thereafter, she was brought to a confession by the minister and elders. While she was being tried alongside a number of alleged witches from Dundixton, the jury listened to the evidence against her, retired and then delivered its verdict. The assize, by plurality of voices, found the accused, Janet Miller, to be clean and not guilty of the crime of sorcery and witchcraft, contained in her decree in respect of non-probation. It was thus, to a certain extent, a limited verdict. Some assizes had adjudged her guilty of at least some of the charges, but the valid votes had been outnumbered by those registering cleansed, hence the reference to the plurality of voices. Nor did the assize declare her innocence. They said merely that the witnesses against her had failed to prove their case. Still, under Scots law, it meant she was free and could not be tried again, especially on those same charges. Janet's case is interesting because it hints at a disjunction between the officials of Kirk and the laity. Aspects of Janet's confession reveal the usual petty flare-up between neighbours, which frequently resulted in charges of witchcraft if some damage, illness or death occurred later on and could be tied to the original outburst, especially if that outburst had been accompanied by words of ill-wishing or cursing. What imparts the favour of the period is the relationship with Satan, the meeting and dancing of witches, the renunciation of baptism and giving of a mark. These aspects speak of clerical interests, perhaps informed by some knowledge of, well, demonological theory, maybe from elsewhere, perhaps not, but an interest in the role played by Satan in corrupting a Christian soul and turning it to evil. Now, the lay jury will certainly not have discounted those features of the case. Far from it. The sermons had heard every Sunday and the church discipline to which they were subjected all emphasised the devil's power, human weakness, the perpetual daily battle to earn or stay within the grace of God. And so there is no reason to imagine the jury members will have ignored Janet's confession and pretended it didn't exist, especially of meeting Satan and having sex with him and attending witches' meetings. Without a record of the results of their deliberations, such as we have in some other cases, it is of course impossible to tell, and we need to make allowance for the possibility that the jury could have been divided as easily as being united on the subject. The same may be said with regard to Janet's maleficence too, for what we do know is the jury, the majority of the jury anyway, they rejected the charges against her as unproven, in spite of the confession drawn from her by the minister and elders. Fearsome the Kirk Sessions may have been in its drive for moral cleansing, but it could be resisted, even in these fraught days, so potentially dangerous for witches, and these reservations about the evidence laid before them tell us that Janet's jurors, well, they were actually divided, and that wasn't something that was well known. They were either usually guilty or set free, never normally divided to a point where they had to set the person free, even though some of them did believe that she was guilty, but yet there were more that did not. And it wasn't that they actually didn't believe she was a witch. What they stated is that the people that spoke of the bad things she did literally had no evidence to prove that she had actually done any of that bad. That's why she was let go. And because she'd been let go, she couldn't go back and have another trial. Not for the same thing anyway. So, yes, she confessed. Yes, she admitted all this. And even after that, there was not enough evidence from the witnesses to state that even what she was saying from her own mouth about herself was true. And that's a very peculiar case because that very rarely ever happened. And not in other places in England. I mean, this is Scotland. We can see the difference. Because had that happened in Essex or Yorkshire or wherever, you can rest assured she would have been hung. Absolutely would have been hung. And so we can see that there's a big difference how the Scottish dealt with their cases compared to how we dealt with ours. Ours were more brutal, I would say. And that's what they were. So, yeah. I'm going to leave this part here, guys. And when we continue, we'll look at how it seems that cases sort of built up and they started to accumulate. And things needed to move fast, actually, because otherwise they would have been overrun with cases and never been able to keep up. I mean, that could have been another reason why Janet got away with it, really. It could have been the fact that there were so many cases they had to get through that they were just doing what they did to be as quick as possible. Who knows? It's just very bizarre that that's how the case turned out, because it's very rare that happens to the woman. Usually they are hung, so just an interesting case, that's all. Thank you for listening, and many blessings. Welcome back to England's Witches, members, and on the podcast if you're listening over there, because I do upload to my members on YouTube, and then I do upload it at the podcast. So we just finished Janet's trial, which was extremely bizarre because it was unproven. The jurors were divided, so she got away with it, which is interesting. Cases which had built up in 1659 and 1660 had continued to accumulate in the last days of the Protectorate and the first months of the English Restoration, burst into the Scottish courts throughout 1661 and 1662. Again, coming principally from the lowlands, although one of the most intriguing, that of Isabel Gowdy in 1662, originated in Aldern, a small town midway between Inverness and Elgin Moray, on the border between Highland and Lowland cultures, meaning that elements of both might reveal themselves in Isabel's confessions and activities. There in the parish church of Aldern in 1647, Isabel met Satan, a large black rough man, at night, and formally renounced her baptism, receiving from him a new name, Janet, and his mark. Thereafter she had sex with him and met him again several times, meanwhile embarking on a series of actions reminiscent of other witches' activities and yet different in their detail. Using a corpse's body parts for magic, for example, was not unusual. Blood, flesh, bone, fat, brains, and skin were all used in contemporary medicine. So actually, the charge that witches were doing something similar was far less charged with horror or disgust than we may be inclined to think. But Isabel describes how she and 3 others, including a man, met in courtyard of the church in Nairn, raised an unchristened child out of its grave, and then took the said child, with the pared nails of our fingers and toes, seeds of all kinds of grain and colewort leaves, mixed them together, chop them very small, put a part thereof among the dung heaps of Mr. Bradley's land, thereby took away the fruits of his corn. This is more detailed than we are usually given. Isabel tells us about ploughing a field one February with a plough constructed from ram's horns and drawn by 3 frogs, guided by the devil and driven by John Young, a member of the group of witches. Isabel calls her coven, a word simply meaning meeting. Such extraordinarily poetic images suggest that Isabel may have been in a dream, a trance-like state, when she saw and experienced these things. Outright dismissal of her narratives as fantasy, inspired by fear or torture, is far too crude a reaction and is not supported by the available highly detailed evidence. And she clearly fascinated the Kirk session, to whose members she described them in 4 separate confessions. And this was between the 13th of April and the 27th of May in 1662. The minister and elders also heard about the witches leaving brooms in their beds to deceive their husbands while they were out at night, flying through the air, eating with the queen and king of the fairies. Finally dressed in white she was, white linen, white and brown clothes. He was a good-looking man with a broad face, stealing cow's milk, spoiling ale, making magical images of people, shape-changing, having attendant spirits, raising the wind, killing people with elf arrows, and both curing and causing illness. Throughout it all, the devil is a near constant companion, frequently having sex with the women, which some of them enjoyed very much. The youngest and lustiest woman will have very great pleasure in their carnal copulation with him, yea, much more than with their own husbands, and they will have an exceeding great desire of it with him, so much as he can have with them, and more, and never think shame of it. He is more able for us that way than any man can be. Alas, that I should compare him to a man, only he was very heavy, like a malt sack, and his penis very cold as ice. He also assists them in their activities, sends them on errands, and provides them with the elf arrows with which they kill their victims. Isabel's ultimate fate is actually not known. We actually don't know. The assumption that she must have been executed isn't warranted, but it's noteworthy that the older minister of the time, Harry Forbes, was sure he had been some sort of victim of witchcraft at his first arrival in the parish in 1655, and Hugh Rose, the minister from nearby Narn, both of whom were zealous for the moral reform of their flocks, were clearly fascinated by the wealth of detail Isabel provided, and pursued her many exotic revelations to see where they laid and led. That the devil was so important a figure in that narrative also intrigued a local landowner, Alexander Brodie of Brodie, an ardent Presbyterian and a judge in witchcraft trials. He too was convinced that witchcraft had been directed against him by his family, as he recorded in his diary on the 24th of March, 1662, lamenting on the 15th of June the prevailing of the devil by witchcraft, as if thou hast given up that place where I had my residence, and the inhabitants of it, to be the devil's property and possession. By October that year, he was almost in despair. I am this day under new excises and trials, the condition of many who fear God in these lands, and their distress, straits, and temptations, the overflowing of sin, profaneness, and looseness, declining darkness, untenderness, the sin of witchcraft and devilry, which has prevailed and cannot be gotten, discovered, and purged out, Satan having set up his very throne among us. As one may expect, Brodie ascribed this dire situation to God's anger at the people's conduct. In June 1655, long before Scotland's circumstances worsened and Murray in particular saw such an outbreak of witchcraft in his territory, Brodie had discussed these matters with an actual friend and relative. This was after supper. He says in his diary, "Aye, after supper, we did speak of family and all the badness that was growing within it, familiar spirits, divination, witchcraft, sorceries alike, and were inquiring into the reason of the Lord's great jealousy against that sin above any other. It was a high degree of undervaluing the Lord, discontentedness, pride, curiosity, unbelief, opening, joining hands, conjunction, and even familiarity. His enemies preferring their counsel, communion, and help to his. It was no wonder that he should take this ill. Hence, it's not surprising to find that when Isabel Elder and Isabel Simpson were executed at Forres, refusing to the end to acknowledge their guilt, Brodie observed, "The Lord seems to shut the door, so that wickedness should not be discovered or expelled out of the land. Oh, let the Lord glorify himself. Bring down this kingdom of Satan and deliver us all. Brody's fear and dejection in the face of what seemed to be overwhelming satanic odds characterises the mood of Scottish authorities, both clerical and lay towards the witchcraft problem of this time. In contrast with that of England, which was much less zealous, much less dark, and tinted with a prevailing anti-Catholicism, not nearly so evident at this time in Scotland. In Ireland, the restoration of the monarchy, proclaimed in Dublin on the 14th of May 1660, brought an uneasy peace, but the religious freedom promised by the Declaration of Breda 1660 was soon undermined by two later Acts of Parliament, which made the Protestant Book of Common Prayer compulsory in 1662 and forbade all meetings in conventicles 1664, a provision aimed largely at independents, separatists, and Presbyterians. Despite its troubled history, however, Ireland, as we have seen, appears to have escaped any large-scale pursuits of witches. So the arrest and investigation of Florence Newton from Youghal, a coastal town in County Cork, on the 24th of March 1661, represented a somewhat unusual event. Why did this happen? Well, it may be that Presbyterian anxiety over the restoration of a king who seemed to be prepared to envisage a balance of toleration between Ireland's bitterly hostile religious confessions temporarily produced a quiet interlude in which people felt they could turn their attentions against witches, as William Cranmer has suggested. Or, since there is no surviving evidence that witchcraft trials broke out elsewhere in Ireland at this time, it may simply be an accident that Florence Newton's behaviour caused reactions which came to a head in 1661, and thus occasioned her trial. Florence was tried for two offences, both committed that same year. The first involved Mary Longden, a servant in the household of John Pine, the town bailiff. According to Mary's evidence, she had known Florence for about 3 or 4 years, and at Christmas, presumably Christmas, 1660, Florence had come to the house, asking for a piece of salted beef. Christmas was upon them, so perhaps Florence was too poor to provide beef for herself or her family. Mary refused. After all, the beef was not hers to give, and Florence went away, irritated and grumbling. A week later, the two women ran into one another as Mary was going to the sea or nearby stream to do laundry. Florence knocked the dirty linen away and gave Mary a hearty kiss, saying, "Mary, I pray thee, let thee and I be friends, for I bear thee no ill will, and I pray thee, do thou bear me none." This sounds like a straightforward attempt at reconciliation, an apology, but according to Mary, there was nothing but disturbing consequences. For a few days later, she saw a veiled woman, a little old man dressed in silk, standing by a bed. The old man removed the woman's veil, revealing her to be Florence Newton, and he himself tried to lure her into accepting his future advice in return for future prosperity. An offer Mary said she refused. Why should Mary have reacted this way to Florence's overture? The gap of a few days between their last meeting and her nighttime vision suggests she had been brooding, and one of the things she may have been thinking about was that kiss, because as the 3 aldermen of Youghal attested at Florence's trial, not long before Florence had kissed their children, and the children then, died soon after. Florence's kissing Mary had been, or so anyone might take it, a gesture of reconciliation. But if Florence had a reputation as a witch, and the children's death under these circumstances would have given her one, even if she was not so considered before, Mary's reaction would not have been one of acceptance as much as suspicion. Such brooding may well have triggered the vision, which seemed to confirm that Florence was a woman with preternatural connections. Her unveiling uncovers her identity and makes it certain. The little old man could have been a fairy, hence his short stature, but is offered to Mary smacked more of the offers that Satan would make. And Satan and sort of the high-class fairies, they are very different as well. They're nowhere near the same. So it's odd that it appears small in stature like a fairy would, but yet it's giving the offerings that a devil would give. Therefore, it would suggest it's more of a devil as Satan, than it is all else. So the conclusion to which he came was that she had been cursed, or something like that anyway. Who knows? Scarcely a month after this, Mary began to have fits and behave in the way common to those possessed by demons, exhibiting unusual strength so that 3 or 4 men could not hold her, vomiting various objects such as pins and wool, while at the same time being subject to a phenomenon closely associated with poltergeists, that is, showers of small stones raining down on her whenever she moved. Some of these she and John Pine caught, but most vanished the moment they hit the ground. During these fits, she said, she was completely unaware of what was happening to her, an extraordinary circumstance, since it seemed she was bodily removed to other places within the house, some of them most uncomfortable, such as a plank between 2 beams in the solar at the top of the house. Teleportation of individuals in poltergeist cases is less common than apparition, or even of objects, but it is by no means unknown. Christina of Stomiln, in the 13th century, for example, was hurled by some unseen force into furniture, dragged out of her house one night, and tied to a tree. The little grandson, William Morse, was flung violently about the grandfather's room in December 1679, and on the 10th of March 1722, Hans Duckelmann and his wife watched in horror as their youngest child was carried up several times into the air before their eyes. In none of these cases, we can rule out the possibility of deception, of course, but neither are we entitled to assume it. These phenomena, coupled with those of the possession and Mary's clear association of them with the incident of Florence's kissing her, produce the accusation, and perhaps even personal conviction, that she could see Florence sticking pins deep in her arms. Some people fetched Florence and made her face Mary. Standard practice in such cases. And while the 2 of them were in the same room, Mary's fits were worse. Respite came only after Florence had been arrested and sent to prison in Cork. Again, quite a familiar pattern. But Mary began fitting again until Florence was bolted, that is, made to wear a collar, which was then bolted to the wall so that she could not move. Wow. Both before she went to prison and after, Florence was subject to tests to prove whether she was a witch or not. One involved taking a roof tile to Mary's house, heating it in the fire and dropping some of Mary's urine on it. While the urine sizzled, Florence suffered severe pain when it evaporated. Florence was well again. This is a variant upon the well-known use of urine in counter-magic and, like other aspects of counter-magic, had its parallel in curative medicine. Another test, however, carried no such medical association. Edward Perry, Valentine Greatrix, and Mr. Blackwall, likely a Church of Ireland minister, having visited Mary, sent for Florence at Greatraix's request, and sat her upon a stool. A shoemaker with a strong awl tried to stick it into the stool, but was unable to do so until his 3rd attempt, after which he found that half an inch had been broken off his blade, and yet no one could see the mark of its entry into the wood. Next, they gave Mary another awl, took hold of her hand, and ran at Florence with it, proposing to run her hand through. The awl bent, but did not pierce Florence's flesh. So they tried yet again, but this time with a lancet. Not surprisingly, perhaps, this did succeed, making a cut an inch and a half long and a quarter of an inch deep, and yet the wound did not bleed. So Mr. Blackwell cut her other hand, and this time both hands bled. These experiments appear to be variations upon two separate themes. One is that if a witch shape changes, it's wounded, the wound will show up again when she resumes her human form. The other is that pricking a mark will test whether the mark bleeds or not, the latter being an indication that she or he is a witch. The use of the old lancet, however, was unusual and was tried at the behest of Valentine Greatrakes, who said he had read about them. From this one might think Greatrakes was a pricker along the lines of Kincaid in Scotland or Hopkins in England. I hate that name. In fact, he was a landowner, justice of peace, clerk of the peace or county clerk, a man who had been strongly attached to the Cromwellian regime in Ireland. An ostensibly respectable figure then, who was relying on, well, literacy, to allow him to test Florence's character. Soon after Florence's trial, though, Greatrakes would become a faith healer and achieve considerable fame in both Ireland and England for his cures, but not universal credit in them. That time, however, has not come. In 1661, indeed, anything which might smack of personal eccentricity may well have been far from his mind, for he had only just recovered his lands and offices after being deprived of them at King Charles' request, his restoration, and then his request, and would be more likely to want to reassure his patron, the Earl of Orrery, and through him the English government, that he could be trusted to do his duty and fulfil his civic obligation. Was Florence a Catholic? There is every chance that actually she was, and the fact that she had annoyed someone as important as a bailiff of Yorhall by magically attacking his servant may have combined with her religion to provide the authorities concerned with a chance to impress Dublin and London. Her removal to Cork for imprisonment and trial would have shifted her to a town from which its Catholic Irish inhabitants had been expelled in 1644 and a number of occasions afterwards, while the Protestants who had replaced them remained in situ even after 1660. The town would therefore have been an uncomfortable place for any Catholic witch. While she was in prison, Florence had been visited by Nicholas Stout, who tried her with another test. Could she recite the Lord's Prayer? This was a common enough test in England, and suspected witches tended to stumble or halt at certain phrases such as the trespasser or the temptation phrase. Florence did her best but kept missing the word trespassers. When she was asked to recite the prayer in court and explained her inability to get it right by saying she was old, she had bad memory. She may have been right, of course, but if she were a Catholic, she would have been more familiar with the prayer in Latin or Gaelic. Hence the slightly unusual English word trespassers might fail to lodge with her, especially if she was frightened and her spirit had been broken by the treatment she'd already received. Because she was tortured, guys, and they really did torture the Catholics. And I'm saying the Catholics, you can call them witches all you want, but you look through history and you tell me they are witches. They are Catholics. They are original, healing, herbal medicine Catholics. That's what they are. Among the frights to which she had been subjected was the threat of being swum. Upon her arrest, Richard Myers, the mayor of Yorhall, had sent for her, and during his examination of her, Florence had accused two other women, Mrs. Halfpenny and Mrs. Dodd, of causing Mary's fits, whereupon Myers had them arrested too and brought all three to a suitable stretch of water, into which they could be thrown, hands and feet tied in a particular manner, their body attached to ropes held by men on the banks to see whether the water accepted or rejected them. Had it rejected them by allowing them to float, it would have provided a sign of their guilt. But the swearing did not take place because Florence clearly confessed to casting the evil eye on Mary. Mary then exonerated Mrs. Halfpenny and Mrs. Dodd, and so Florence was left to be taken to Gaul and Cork. There she was visited by Nicholas Pine, an old associate of Great Rakes, and also a relation of John Pine, and by several other men, and repeated her affirmation that she had not bewitched Mary, but overlooked her, and now begged her forgiveness for the wrong she had done. She added, however, that she herself could not undo the harm, but that others, such as Mrs. Halfpenny and Mrs. Dodd, have the ability to do so, unless one of them had done the harm in the first place. Was Florence saying the first thing that came into her head, if all this had been taking place at the same time, as Glanville's text suggests? Florence may well have been sufficiently frightened, disorientated to blurt out apparently desperate remarks, but none of them necessarily means she was not telling the truth. Her distinction between bewitching and overlooking is significant, inasmuch as one was as bad as the other in the eyes of the law, so Florence had nothing to gain by insisting upon the difference. Her reiteration of the names of Mrs. Halfpenny and Mrs. Dodds too was not a renewal of her former accusation, but a avowal that there were workers of counter magic in your home, among whom were Mrs. Halfpenny and Mrs. Dodd. There's nothing inherently unlikely in any of this, nor in an incident which followed soon after, towards evening. The prison door shook, and a loud noise was heard, as if somebody with bolts and chains had been running up and down the room. It made Florence get to her feet. She called out, "What are you doing here at this time of night?" But when questioned about it, said she had no idea what had caused the noise, or if she had said anything at all. So far, so plausible. It's not unknown, for example, earth tremors to be felt in Cork, 1755 and 1761. They provide historical examples, and if Florence had been asleep or dozing, she may well have startled into saying something incoherent, but apparently meaningful. The next day, however, and under what pressure, if any, we do not know, she said it was a spirit, her familiar, in the shape of a greyhound. This is very much an English rather than an Irish idea, so her confession sounds rather like acquiescence in a suggestion put to her by someone else. But however much these tests and admissions may have contributed to the prosecution's case, we don't know. Two incidents, more than the others, would surely have loomed large at Florence's trial. One was her behaviour, and that of Mary during the trial itself. Mary had just finished giving her evidence, closing with the remark that she had never had fits before. Florence had kissed her, and that therefore it was the kiss which had caused them in conviction strengthened. She said, because Nicholas Payne and others had told her Florence had confessed as much, when Florence raised her manacled hands and shook them at Mary, saying, "Now she is down," whereupon Mary had a violent fit, and had to be carried out of the court into a nearby house, where she vomited pins, pieces of straw, and wool. Florence, meanwhile, sat alone in her place, pinching her hands and arms. How much of this is true? The fit and vomiting, certainly, even if one is going to suggest, without evidence, that they may have been faked. That Florence lifted her hands was observed by the court. Her words were sworn to by two men, Roger Moore, Thomas Harrison. Did she actually say them? She was said to have uttered others a quarter of an hour later, when a messenger came from the house to report that Mary was feeling better. "She is not well yet," many heard Florence say, angrily but under her breath, although Florence denied saying anything and explained anything she may have said as a result of her old age, fear and suffering. The whole incident was most dramatic. Those present were certainly inclined to interpret Florence's alleged words and actions as proof of malefice. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, if one compares the behaviour of Isabel Thompson from Northumberland. She lifted up her hands at Mark Humble's back as she passed him in the street, and for years afterwards he said he was ill with violent fits. Whether she did say anything is difficult to tell. It's quite possible she did. Either if she suspected Mary of faking, now she's down, now she's not well yet, can be interpreted as sarcastic comments on a histrionic performance. Or if she believed that she was genuinely causing these reactions, she may have done. It shows how very difficult it is for us now to interpret the records, since as many indicators, tones of voice, relationships between individuals, the personal, political, or religious motives of those involved, their states of health and so forth, well, they are missing. We cannot usually be supplied from other sources. The second incident took place in April 1661. Florence had been in prison for about a month when she received a visit one night from David Jones and Francis Beasley. They went because rumours were flying about that Florence had several familiars resorting to her in sundry shapes, and they were curious to see whether they could observe any cats or other creatures resort to her through the grate, as it was suspected they did. This was the principal purpose of witches, being watched. Not to deprive them of sleep, apparently, though obviously we believe otherwise, but to make sure they could not escape with the help of their familiars, or to indulge a curiosity about a witch's behaviour when she was in confinement. Expectation of remarkable phenomena could have been high. Anne Foster, for example, committed to prison in 1674, was chained to a post at one point, but then released, so that the devil might come to succour. The witch he usually did, coming constantly about the dead time of night in the likeness of a rat, which, at his coming, made a most lamentable and hideous noise, which caused many to come and see her during her abode there, and several hath been with her when the devil hath been